After the enormous success of Back to the Future, the studio asked writer Bob Gale and director Robert Zemeckis to return for a sequel, with the mild threat that if they didn't, the studio would go ahead and make it without them. After Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd agreed to return, the Bobs began writing the script, which originally featured Doc and Marty traveling back in time to the flower power era of the 1960s.
I'm back in the 60s, baby, yeah!
With no cliffhanger leading to a third film in the Wild West. So let's dive in and take a look at what could have been the 1960s version of Back to the Future 2. Speaking of going back in time and changing the past, when it came time to write the sequel, the filmmakers wished they could do just that, as they regretted ending the first film the way that they did. And that's because when they wrote the first movie, they had no plans of ever making a sequel, with the ending written as a joke. But as they began to write Part 2, they realized they were stuck having to continue the cliffhanger they wrote at the end of Part 1, instead of being free to come up with a whole new adventure.
It's your kids, Marty. Something has got to be done about your kids.
So not only would the second film have to start in the future, but it would have to be about helping Marty and Jennifer's kids, while the Bobs would also have to give Jennifer something to do as well, since Doc invited her along.
Well, bring her along. This concerns her too.
That last part would be their biggest regret, as they weren't keen on Jennifer taking part in the adventure, which is why in the finished film, she's unconscious for most of it. And while the two Bobs would eventually receive some criticism and accusations of misogyny for sidelining Jennifer while the quote-unquote boys have all the fun, in defense of this decision, Jennifer just isn't an interesting character. In fact, she's pretty one-dimensional, since in the first film, she plays a very minor role. So I don't really blame the Bobs for casting her aside. In the years since, Bob Gale was on record saying that if they had known they were going to do a sequel, they never would have had Jennifer get in a car at the end of Part 1. Having said all that, in the original version of the script for Part 2, Doc doesn't put her to sleep. After they land in 2015 Hill Valley, Doc tells Marty and Jennifer to stay in the alleyway while he goes and gets a few items for their mission. After he leaves, Marty and Jennifer ignore him, venture out, and start exploring Courthouse Square. Eventually, Marty buys the almanac before he and Jennifer get separated. And just like how Marty looks up Doc in the phone book in the first film, Jennifer looks up 2015 Marty and heads to their family home, where she overhears a fight between her future self and 2015 Marty, and learns that he'll eventually blow off their trip to the lake for a get-rich-quick scheme that almost puts him in jail, which is when his life begins to spiral out of control. As a side note, there's a much greater emphasis in this script on present and future Marty always looking to make a quick buck at the expense of hard, honest work, with his character flaw of being called a chicken completely absent. Here's where the story really starts to diverge from the one we all know. After Biff gets his hands on the almanac and steals the DeLorean, he travels back to 1967 to give young Biff the almanac. And he chooses that year because in 1967, Biff inherited $25,000, which 2015 Biff convinces him to wager and use to build his fortune. Then, just like in the finished film, Doc, Marty, and Jennifer return to 1985, only to find out it's an alternate 1985. So back to 1967, Marty and Doc go to fix the present in the past. Except Biff sends his crooked cops to stop them.
I own the police!
What follows is a thrilling sequence where Doc and Marty take to the air in the DeLorean, which gets damaged in the ensuing shootout, forcing Doc and Marty to nosedive it from hundreds of feet in the air and use gravity to get it up to 88 miles an hour in order to go back in time to 1967. The DeLorean is damaged further after they arrive. But in the meantime, their goal is to steal back the almanac, so Doc dresses Marty up as a stereotypical hippie, similar to what he does to Marty in the third movie when he dresses him up as a stereotypical cowboy, and sends him into town to track down Biff. After Marty recovers the almanac from Biff, he draws the attention of the police, as he learns that Hill Valley is very anti-hippie, making him stand out like a sore thumb. The police arrest him and throw him in jail for not having a draft card, before he's bailed out by his mom Lorraine, who is also a hippie and thus empathizes with his plight. Strangely, she doesn't recognize him from 1955 and thinks he's a different person entirely. As they have dinner at Lorraine's parents' house, Marty learns that George, her now husband, is away at Berkeley on a teaching fellowship in literature. Lorraine had planned to travel to meet him for their anniversary, but she used up her travel money bailing Marty out of jail. Suddenly, Marty realizes that he was conceived on this very vacation, and if Lorraine doesn't go, he'll never be born. The rest of the movie plays out somewhat similar to the first one, with the A plot of having to find enough energy to power the DeLorean to get Marty and Doc back to the future, and the B plot of Marty trying to get his mom to go visit George at Berkeley so that they can conceive Marty. Marty attempts several times to get money to Lorraine to pay for her trip, pretending to send it from relatives, etc. But Lorraine turns it down or returns it each time. Remember, she's a hippie. Hippie. Eventually, Lorraine asks Marty to speak at an anti-war rally, which is this film's version of the climactic Under the Sea dance. Biff tries to crash it, but Marty knocks him out and gives a heartfelt speech about the importance of love and family. He then asks all the hippies in attendance to pitch in so that Lorraine can go visit George. Unfortunately, the entire sequence doesn't really reach the highs, thrills, or tension of the Under the Sea dance from the first film. There's none of those fulfilling character moments here, and unfortunately, the entire sequence feels like a hollow retread of the first film.
That's the problem with sequels. The audiences have opinions. They want the same movie but different. So what you have to do is you have to say, okay, how do you make the same movie that is different but not too different? The same but not too much the same. And it's really, really a difficult thing to do. And for a filmmaker, it's not really a fulfilling thing to do.
For the A-plot, Marty enlists the help of 1967 Doc Brown, who's now a hippie, to repair the DeLorean, as both Marty and 1985 Doc need his lab in order to do so. While 1985 Doc stays out of sight so as not to interfere with history, 1967 Doc concocts a plan after dropping LSD to harness the electricity from elevated high-tension power lines, which run over a giant canyon. In order to funnel enough power into the DeLorean to send it back to the future, Doc plans to create an explosion that will overload the wires at the exact moment Marty flies the DeLorean into them. What 1967 Doc doesn't realize is that Marty will be traveling back to the future with 1985 Doc, and the added weight would completely throw off his calculations. 1985 Doc finally realizes this only 2 minutes before the bomb goes off, resulting in him and Marty tossing anything and everything out of the DeLorean, including its doors, in order to make up for Doc's added weight as they hurtle across the canyon. Eventually, Marty throws his knapsack out, which contains the almanac, as they finally make weight and head back to the future. The knapsack containing the almanac lands next to Otis Peabody, who is camping with his wife in the canyon. He keeps the knapsack but throws the almanac in the fire, thinking it's worthless. There's a running gag in the film similar to Dr. Silberman in the Terminator franchise, where Peabody keeps seeing Marty and Doc's DeLorean over the years, driving him more and more insane, as we learn that he was committed to an insane asylum after thinking his first encounter with the DeLorean in his farmhouse was a real close encounter. The film ends with Marty rejecting his so-called friend's offer to make a quick buck, as he decides to go to the lake with Jennifer as he had planned. Doc then shows up in the DeLorean as Marty hands him an item from the future that is now blank, similar to what Jennifer does at the end of part 3, as Marty asks him what it means, to which Doc replies,
It means your future hasn't been written yet.
The movie finally ends with Marty asking Doc if he's going to go back to the future, as Doc tells him he's done with time traveling and instead plans to travel to another dimension before he speeds off in the DeLorean. So how do we go from traveling back in time to the 1960s to traveling back to the events of the first movie and then to the Wild West? Well, as Bob Gale was writing this, Robert Zemeckis was shooting Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and when Gale turned in the script to Zemeckis, he seemed less than enthusiastic about it.
He said, well, you know, this is okay, but we can do something that nobody's ever done before. We can actually, with a time machine, go back into the first movie and look at it from a different point of view. Wouldn't that be cool? I said, yeah, that would be cool. And then Bob said, you know, it would be really great is if we went into the Old West after that.
It was a once-in-a-lifetime situation that no other filmmaker has ever had before, because here I had a situation where I was doing a sequel to a time travel movie where a character goes back and visits the original movie. So you have a chance to make the first movie again from another point of view. And it was really something that thrilled me to do it.
From here, Gale rewrote the script into the one we all know, except originally it was one long movie, prompting Spielberg to suggest cutting it into 2.
Bob and Bob handed me the sequel script. You know, it was like 185 pages or something like that. And it just seemed like 2 movies.
And while filming movies and their sequels back-to-back is much more common today, back then it was pretty rare, as the Bobs would be inspired to do it by the Three Musketeers and Four Musketeers.
We thought that was really cool, that they shot those 2 movies back to back at the same time.
One of the standouts from the first film is Crispin Glover's awkward yet incredible performance as George McFly, and I'd argue that his presence, which was such a pillar of the first film, is sorely missed in the sequels. Now, according to Bob Gale, Glover didn't return because he asked for too much money.
Crispin decided that he should get things that were way out of line for an actor of Crispin's stature to be asking for at this point in his career. I said, okay, thank him very much, and we'll just write George McFly out of the sequel. That is the reason that George McFly is a tombstone in Part 2.
However, according to Glover, he was offered less than half of what his fellow actors were offered, even though they'd all be coming back for similar-sized roles. And while Glover claims that he just wanted to be fairly compensated, it's also been reported that he asked for $1 million, significantly more than his fellow actors. Here's the thing though, Glover was apparently a massive pain in the ass on the first film. According to several people, with even Glover himself hinting at it, he was incredibly difficult to work with, had trouble following directions, and questioned even the simplest of directions from Bob Zemeckis.
You really think I ought to swear?
This came to a head when Glover openly conveyed his disdain for the ending, telling Zemeckis that audiences won't like it as he felt it sent the wrong message.
I said to Robert Zemeckis, I thought it was not a good idea for our characters to have a monetary reward, because it basically makes the moral of the film be that money equals happiness. And, you know, by having the son character cheer by having a truck in the garage, what I was arguing for was that that the characters should be in love, and that the love should be the reward.
This was the last straw for Zemeckis, who snapped at Glover and yelled at him. This would also be the last scene Glover filmed with Eric Stoltz, and when Glover returned to reshoot this scene with Michael J. Fox, Zemeckis made it very clear to him that he was not happy with him or his performance, resulting in Glover cleaning up his act a little bit out of fear of being fired just like Stoltz. When the part was finally recast for Part 2, with Jeffrey Weissman taking over for Glover, cinematographer Dean Cundy enthusiastically declared during Weissman's initial makeup test, "I think we have Crispin, but without the trouble." And while the filmmakers alleged that they decided to hang replacement Jeffrey Weissman upside down so that audiences wouldn't be able to tell it wasn't Glover, according to Glover, that's not true either, as that was in the version of the script that he read when he was offered the part, leading Glover to feel that it was only included to torture him as payback for the headaches that he caused during the filming of the first film. Glover would eventually sue and win a landmark case against Universal, not because he was recast, but because the actor that played him was made up with prosthetics based on an old face mold of his in order to look just like him. Glover also wouldn't be the only actor replaced for the sequel, as Claudia Wells, who played Jennifer, left to reportedly care for her ill mother, leading the filmmakers to reshoot the ending of Part 1, now the opening of Part 2, shot for shot but with Elisabeth Shue instead. While the second movie's dark tone threw a lot of people off when they first saw it and still remains somewhat divisive, Bob Gale says that Nightmare Hill Valley is his favorite stuff in the whole trilogy.
Well, you know, the template for a dark, second act in a trilogy was set by George Lucas when he made the first 3 Star Wars. And Empire Strikes Back is clearly the darker of the 3 films, and for me, the best of the first 3 Star Wars episode, 4, 5, and 6. And so, yeah, the second act was the dark act, but you have to go into a kind of abyss before you can climb out and become a hero in the spotlight.
However, whether you like the sequel or not, what you can't argue is how it turned convention on its head. And instead of merely replicating the original, like most sequels do, literally took us back to the original and let us experience it from a different perspective, which in my humble opinion was utterly brilliant. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Bullets and Blockbusters for more great content.